wonderful Mass. What a great way to kind of, as we think through the themes of beauty and wonder, to take in the most beautiful and wondrous sacrament of our faith into our very bodies. It's a great way to have this at our conference. So now I want to introduce our final keynote for the symposium. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Newsome, who is a systematic theologian. Newsome Martin, my apologies. Is a systematic theologian with areas of interest in 19th and 20th century Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thought, Trinitarian theology, theological aesthetics, religion and literature, French feminism, ressourcement theology, and the nature of religious tradition. She is an award-winning writer on the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar, and has written on numerous other topics for venues such as Modern Theology, Communio, the Newman Studies Journal, International Journal of Systematic Theology, and a number of edited volumes and collections of essays. She serves on the editorial board of Religion and Literature and the University of Notre Dame Press, as well as steering committees of the Hans Urs von Balthasar Consultation of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Christian Systematic Theological Unit in the American Academy of Religion. She is the John J. Kavanaugh Associate Professor of the Humanities, as well as the Director of the Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin.
Good evening, friends. Hello. It's been such a lovely weekend, hasn't it? I've just had a lovely time here at Benedictine College's 15th annual symposium on transforming culture. I'm so grateful to all the conference organizers, to my fellow speakers, my fellow presenters, all of the attendees, all of you for your very generous hospitality, your curiosity, your attentiveness, and I'd like to say a debt of gratitude as well to Archbishop McKnight for presiding over what was a beautiful liturgy. In my capacity as the director of the Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame, we also host a very large interdisciplinary conference to which you're all invited. I hope you can come. So I do have some inkling of just how much work, how much thought and planning and logistical heavy lifting is required to pull together an event like this one. So I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute in some small way, and thank you for having me. Congratulations on a very successful conference. The title of my talk is What Good Are Poets in Barren Times? It is drawn from Friedrich Hölderlin's famous poetic elegy, Bread and Wine, which he wrote between 1800 and 1801. In 9 discrete stanzas, one perhaps for each muse, Hölderlin invites his readers into the lonely dark of a resting city, into the sad, sanctified, moonlit night, that fanciful dreamer full of stars, into the perfumed antiquity of ancient Greece, Olympus, Citharon, Athens, Thebes, where bright Dionysus himself, god of revelry and wine, soon approaches. But alas, Hölderlin's holy city, once brimming with the glories of heavenly presence, has been emptied of thrones, temples, vessels, nectar, songs, theaters, and oracles. It turns out that we have arrived too late. The gods have almost altogether withdrawn to some other plane. And thus it seems to the speaker of this poem that it is, quote, better to sleep now than to be so companionless, waiting like this. And he does not know what's to do and to say in the meantime. Nor can he say what good the poets are in such barren times, even if and as they are wanderers and holy priests of the wine god, moving from land to land on through the holy night. Here, of course, we should acknowledge that to the ancient Greeks, including in Hölderlin's German Romantic reimagining, the poets functioned precisely as mediators of the divine. According to Plato's Ion, the epic poets and the lyric poets are ecstatically inspired and possessed by the gods, and are thus not in their right minds. For a poet, Socrates says, is an airy thing, winged and holy. On this understanding, then, the poems do not even, properly speaking, originate from human beings, but are divine and from gods, and the poets are nothing but representatives of the gods, possessed by whoever possesses them. Thus, if the gods have withdrawn, the poets have also lost their power to speak. The speaker's haunting question, what good are poets in barren times, will be ours to take up this evening, albeit expanded thematically beyond these famous lines of German Romanticism. To ask it, and ask it with sincerity, raises a compelling set of questions, not only for the literary and theological past, but also within our own zeitgeist. Who, for instance, in our context, are the poets? How broadly and capaciously can we construe what is meant by poetry? What constitutes barren times? Are we ourselves in barren times? Have we always been in barren times? What does it mean, not only for the ancient Greeks or for Hölderlin, but here, today, right now, not to be able to sense the presence of the divine in the world around us? Do we have the eyes to see, the ears to hear? Or does the divine also hover just out of our sight? How has our attention to reality, and by that I mean not merely the empirical or the measurable, but that invisible transcendence of things which is really real, become so impoverished? And does the present culture in which we are living only exacerbate this impoverishment? Have our eyes and ears been irreparably dulled by the pervasive mediations of screens, AI, social media, or even just our collective incapacity to attend sufficiently well anymore to long-form media, like novels, plays, or even movies? Have our eyes and ears capitulated to the broader culture's ruinous tendency to see the goods of the world primarily in terms of their economy, efficacy, profit, or exchange value? If so, how shall we then live? Finally, does the Benedictine charism itself, situated within those marvelous wilds of Catholic thought, practice, and forms of life, have anything itself to offer, particularly toward the rehabilitation of poets, poetry, and poesis, in what turn out to be these dreadfully barren times? That, friends, is a foreshadowing of where we're going. Before we get there, however, I'd like to think together first about the literary, philosophical, and theological history of the goods of poets and poetry in impoverished times. Were we to extrapolate Hölderlin's question a bit further out of its antique context and say that the poets are just poets, that is, writers of symbolic language in verse, and barren times are simply those human experiences of desolation or abandonment, there is, of course, a whole cloud of witnesses to which we could appeal. Think, for instance, of Homer's wayward, weary, storm-tossed protagonist, Odysseus, in Book 8 of the Odyssey, shipwrecked on the island of the Phaeacians, listening to the poet Demodocus sing not only of the brutal losses of the Trojan War, but also of his own exploits with the stratagem of the Trojan horse. As he listens to the poet, Odysseus, quote, was melting into tears. His cheeks were wet with weeping, as a woman weeps as she falls to wrap her arms around her husband, fallen fighting for his home and children. She is watching as he gasps and dies. She shrieks, a high, clear wail, collapsing upon his corpse. The men are right behind. They hit her shoulders with their spears and lead her to slavery, hard labor, and a life of pain. Her face is marked with her despair. In that same desperate way, Odysseus was crying. Why does Odysseus weep in this way? He does not say exactly. One might surmise, however, that the poem of the bard conjures up for our hero an admixture of grief, guilt, nostalgia, loss, homesickness, and war trauma. Barren times indeed. On another faraway island in Homer's Odyssey, Telemachus consoles his mother Penelope, and the poet Phemius sings of the soldier's difficult and dangerous return from Troy. She's troubled and wants him to leave off. "Stop, please, Phemius," she says. "You know so many songs, enchanting tales of things that gods and men have done, the deeds that singers publicize. Sing something else. Stop this upsetting song that always breaks my heart, so I can hardly bear my grief." Telemachus counsels her, however, that the poets are not to blame for how things are. Then there's Hesiod's Theogony, which offers a litany of the 9 muses, Memory, Clio, Polymnia, Calliope, all among them, who tell of what is and what will be and what was before, harmonizing in their sound. They bring great beauty and joy, not only to Zeus and the other gods on Mount Olympus, but also a certain consolation to the frailties and exigencies of human experience. Even, Hesiod notes, if someone who has unhappiness in his newly anguished spirit is parched in his heart with grieving, yet when a poet, servant of the Muses, sings of the glorious deeds of people of old and the blessed gods who possess Olympus, he forgets his sorrows at once and does not remember his anguish at all, for quickly the gifts of the goddesses have turned it aside. The Bible, too, is a repository of images apropos to our theme, not only of barrenness per se, think of Pharaoh's dream of the 7 thin cows eating up the 7 plump cows, or the 7 blighted leaves, ears of grain swallowing up the good grain in Genesis 41, or the paradigmatic trope of barren women across the Hebrew Bible, including Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, and others. But it's also a testament to the lived experience of suffering and the concomitant turn to verse, hymn, poetry, and prayer. The Book of the Psalms, of course, invites its readers not only to dwell within its poetry in order to praise, but also to enter them in order to mourn, or be desolate, or lonely, or even to be angry. To me, there are no bleaker lines in the Psalms than those which give voice to the loneliness, abandonment, and despair in Psalm 88, which ends its lament with no resolution whatever, but only the resigned admission that my only companion is darkness. One might also think of the forlorn hope of the exiled Dante, the paradigmatically wandering pilgrim and poet, whose longing for home altogether suffuses the pages of his Divine Comedy and crests, perhaps, in the sad but ultimately unfulfilled hope that he might someday return to his beloved Florence. If it should happen, he opines, if this sacred poem, this work so shared by heaven and by earth, that it has made me lean through these long years, can ever overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair fold where I slept, a lamb opposed to wolves that war on it. By then with other voice, with other fleece, I shall return as poet, and put on it my baptismal font, the laurel crown. This side of heaven, however, Dante never goes home again, not as a citizen, nor as poet. We could multiply these examples nigh unto eternity of the making of many books. Of course, there is no end. If we had but whirled enough in time, we could invoke lines from St. John of the Cross, who composed his mystical poetry of the dark night of the soul from the confines of his imprisonment in Toledo, or Gerard Manley Hopkins' so-called terrible sonnets, written in the barren agony of his Irish exile in Dublin. There he seemed a stranger, pitched past pitch of grief. There he woke to feel the fell of dark, not day, and himself took on the names of gall and heartburn. Or we might remember Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, whose long poem Requiem was written in fits and starts during the Stalinist purges, its lines secretly and quietly conveyed to her closest friends, who committed them to memory so she could burn the pages upon which they were written. We might think of David Jones, the Welsh Catholic poet, painter, and typographer, whose 1937 prose poem, in parenthesis, marks the strange, uncanny traumas of his service in World War I, or think in a more contemporary idiom of Maya Angelou's triumphant poem, Still I Rise, in the context of racial oppression and discrimination. From this brief recitation of examples, we can surmise more than a few things about what might constitute the barren times of a human life. Homesickness, war and its aftermath, grief, famine, political or social exile and oppression, sickness, loneliness, depression, dereliction, spiritual desolation, and many times some or even all of these together. It is no wonder, then, that human beings from the epics of old, even to the very present moment, have persistently turned to whatever consolations there may be in meter, symbol, image, and verse, in such times of suffering and difficulty. Figurative, lyrical, and symbolic language has a singular capacity to give precise voice and expression to that which is most complicated and inarticulable. Indeed, poetry and literature are thus often far more precise than ordinary speech. But we must not be neglectful of our dear poet Hölderlin, with whom we began. Fundamentally, what Hölderlin seems to have meant by barren times was the time and the space where, because the ancient and venerable divinities have withdrawn, there was a palpable absence of the divine, and thus no poetry, no song, no festival, and no feast. It was Joseph Pieper, whose little book, Only the Lover Sings, has aptly supplied the title for our august gathering this weekend, who suggested that by barren times, Hölderlin means a state or situation in which the human being has been rendered unable to celebrate a feast. Such a diagnosis is, of course, commensurate with his argument in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that human beings seem to have forgotten the disposition necessary for this contemplative leisure, namely an acknowledgement of the giftedness of being and reality as such, and the attendant attitudes of receptivity, stillness, and worship that such an acknowledgement would encourage. In Pieper's diagnosis, we have replaced this rich spirit of contemplative leisure and festival with what he calls total work, where human activity is radically instrumentalized and where human beings are seen by others and more tragically often see themselves as mere functionaries, beholden entirely to the specter of use. According to Pieper, we have lost our collective ability to see the really real, that invisible transcendence, which does in fact illumine all things in their depth dimension, which is now, at least culturally speaking, beyond our ken and beyond our grasp. Hölderlin and Pieper are, of course, not the only canaries in the coal mine here. There's an entire subgenre of books in philosophy, theology, and history, which offer in somewhat different idioms these melancholy genealogies of modernity, and speak to how Western culture has moved away from Gerard Manley Hopkins' sense that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. These diagnostic texts include examples like Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Charles Péguy's Notes on Descartes and Bergson, the first volume of Hans Urs von Balthasar's Glory of the Lord and His Love Alone is Credible, that opening volley of Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, Louis Dupre's Passage to Modernity, Remy Brague's The Wisdom of the World, Cyril O'Regan's Gnostic Return or Heterodox Hegel, Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, Regina Schwartz's Sacramental Poetics at the Dawn of Secularism, When God Left the World, and Thomas Vowell's Minding the Modern, among many others. In most of these assessments, albeit in different voices and from different perspectives, there's a growing sense that modern cultures, broadly speaking, no longer value or reward perception of the deep mysteries of being, which constitute reality, have lost the capacity for symbolic thought, fail to glimpse or to grasp the dearest freshness deep down things, or else have the sense that the divine, if present at all, is up there somewhere, distant and far away. More often than not, however, that which is understood to be really real is reduced to the demonstrable, empirical, or scientific. We have, as the poet said, sadly arrived too late. In his Love Alone is Credible, for instance, Hans Urs von Balthasar laments the loss of the ancient, biblical, and medieval view of the cosmos as luminous with mystery and divine presence, which has in an age of rationalism and empiricism been, for all practical purposes, naturalized and desacralized. According to Balthasar, this shift has resulted in forms of religion which are purely ethical, coupled with the sense, after Kant, that human beings simply do not have access to the realm beyond the visible, observable, sensible universe. Nor do we any longer have the eyes to behold beauty, if by beauty we mean the depth or splendor of things which shimmers out from the core of reality and being in order to animate form. This loss is, at least for Balthasar, absolutely catastrophic. As he puts it on the very first page of his multi-volume Theological Aesthetics, quote, "We no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order the more easily to dispose of it. We can be sure that whoever sneers at her name can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love." Balthasar's entire program of theological aesthetics is built upon the firm conviction that this anemic way of seeing reality is marked by a growing dullness of the spiritual senses, an incapacity to engage with the depths of being, and a failure to understand that beauty is in fact a metaphysical rather than a merely cosmetic reality. In fact, his primary intervention in the trilogy is to recover the metaphysical, transcendental nature of beauty that was ascendant in Plato, Plotinus, and Pseudo-Dionysus, rehabilitate the notion of form from figures like Aristotle, and much later Goethe, and reintroduce the idea from Albertus Magnus of the splendor formae, the splendor of the form. There is thus a close relationship between beauty and being, between seeing and beauty. Aesthetics and metaphysics here come close enough to touch. Of course, since the time Balthasar and Pieper made their respective interventions in the 1950s and 1960s, the crisis of our contemplative vision has arguably gotten even more dire, and thus the spiritual and interior poverty it engenders even more acute. Wisdom, too, whether contemplative or practical, suffers a double displacement, first by knowledge and then by mere information. It is not only that human beings have displaced the gods, making themselves the center of the universe, but also, perhaps to put it blithely, that machines have come to replace human beings, at least in certain respects. With the advent of AI and large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini, there's a temptation to outsource human thought, agency, and creativity, to bypass that agonistic process of writing or even artistic creation to something more frictionless, bland, and immediate. The difficulty, of course, is that these LLMs are not actually doing something that can be called thinking. Unlike human beings, who have a quickening interior life which moves, like all being, toward expressivity, these models have no internal life which can rise to the level of representation and expression. It's certainly possible there are goods in these technological developments, but the real danger, as I see it, is that human beings, like my students, maybe like your students, may come retrospectively to see the function of their own minds as like unto these machines. Formulaic, algorithmic data centers who inform but do not interpret. But such an anthropology would be deeply pernicious, and would also be deeply false. If it is a valid worry, and it is, to say that a superficial account of beauty does not account for the metaphysical or depth dimension which touches that shimmering core of reality, it is far more worrisome to me if a human being lives a life content only with his surface dimension, forfeiting his birthright of the fathomless warrens of the soul's interior castle where God dwells, for screens, doom scrolling, and infinite distraction. We rightly scoff at Esau for trading his birthright as firstborn son for a bowl of stew, which he will eat and then promptly get hungry again. And yet we often turn away from the reality of our own inner capacity for transcendence, just to scroll and always to be hungry again. For thinkers like Jacques Maritain, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, Joseph Pieper, there really is something real at stake in the neglect of beauty, festival, poetry, and leisure. Not only in the field of ideas, but also in and for everyday life in common. Without beauty, Balthasar thinks, the world, quote, falls under the dominion of knowledge, and the springs and forces of love immanent in the world are overpowered and finally suffocated by an exclusive focus on science and technology. The result, he says, is a world in which power and the profit margin are the sole criteria, where the disinterested, the useless, purposeless is despised, persecuted, and in the end exterminated. A world in which art itself is forced to wear the mask and features of technique. This, of course, does not mean Balthasar was against science and technology as such, but only its overreach, since it simply cannot account for the full range and mystery of human experience. Jacques Maritain says something much the same in his Creative Intuition, where science as a method or general approach or disposition has to do with concepts, judgments, and reasonings by means of which things are known. In short, it is oriented toward an object. But Maritain configures poetry, on the other hand, as that which has no object. Rather, it, like beauty itself, awakens in human beings the sense of our own mysterious identity and draws us toward the sources of being. Poetry, therefore, moves us toward our own transcendence. How, though, might we who are dwelling in these barren times come to learn to see again? Come to learn to see with what Balthasar has called resurrection eyes. First thing we must do is not lose hope. It can be far too easy when dwelling in barren times to yield to despair. As Catholics well know, however, God has not, unlike the Olympian gods and Herdelin's bread and wine, in point of fact, abandoned his creation. God's sustaining presence holds the world and all of reality, all that is made, as Julian of Norwich has it, as a little precarious hazelnut that is and will be precisely because it is so held and so sustained. It lasteth and ever shall because God loveth it, says Julian. And in Catholic churches, cathedrals, and basilicas all over the world, divine presence is tenaciously signaled by the flame of the sanctuary lamp. Our temples are not barren. The French poet Charles Péguy has God speak of the fragile tenacity of that little lit candle, which seems so delicate, but is in fact the most powerful force in the world. What must my grace, God asks, and the strength of my grace be so, that this little hope, vacillating at the breath of sin, trembling with every wind, anxious at the slightest breath, be as constant, remain as faithful, as righteous, as pure and invincible and immortal and impossible to extinguish as that little flame in the sanctuary, that burns eternally in the faithful lamp. One trembling flame, Peggy says, has endured the weight of worlds. One vacillating flame has endured the weight of time. One anxious flame has endured the weight of nights. Since the first time my grace flowed for the creation of the world, since my grace has been flowing forever for the preservation of the world, since that time that the blood of my Son flowed for the salvation of the world, a flame impossible to reach, impossible to extinguish with the breath of death. I think also of the epigraph to David Jones's war poem in parenthesis that I mentioned above. For his epigraph, he takes a line from Maurice de la Tale's The Mystery of Faith about the sacramental presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The epigraph is, he placed himself in the order of signs. Christ is thus deeply present, even when in times of war, he who became body and host, allowing himself to be handled and mishandled. And even as Herdelin's bread and wine laments the departure of the great Bacchic Dionysus, the twice-born one who once walked upon the earth, there is a stirring on the horizon near the end of the poem, where that other, truer, twice-born one appears, and myth becomes a flesh and blood reality so capacious that the whole wounded world can be nestled within the wound of his side, where from the blood and water of the sacramental life of the church is poured out. In Herdelin's poem, it is in that barren, desolate, twilight landscape, evacuated of divinity, that the figure of Christ at last appears as, quote, a quiet genius, heavenly comforter, who proclaimed the end of days and was gone. What he leaves behind, however, is divine presence under the form of the Eucharist, which Herdelin evokes as, quote, some thankfulness still. Body and blood, soul and divinity. The bread is fruit of the earth, blessed by the sunlight, and from the thundering God issues the joy of the wine. It is Christ and Christ alone who is the God of bread and wine. It is Christ and Christ alone who, entering into that lonely twilight, is able to reconcile daylight and darkness. Take heart, this quiet genius says, for I have overcome the world. Thus, barrenness itself is no reason for our despair. What we must do next, however, is restore our eyes and cultivate our God-given power of true sight, true hearing. How does one do such a thing? We will do this, of course, through a return to poetry. That is, through allowing ourselves to be remade and reconfigured as the poets that we already are, simply in virtue of our human natures. Obviously, here I mean something quite a bit more capacious than a narrow literary definition of poetry, poets, and the poetic. I mean something closer to what Pieper offered in his 1950 Only the Lover Sings, or what Jacques Maritain articulated in his Creative Intuition, published in 1953. In the face of barren times, Pieper recommends as an antidote a return to poetry, broadly speaking, by which he meant the recovery of the human capacity for contemplation, wherein we might see, if but for a fragile moment, the hidden ultimate reason of the living universe, the divine foundation of all that is, which is nothing else for Pieper than the very essence of reality. His intent in Only the Lover Sings, he says, is to make one thing clear, that music, the fine arts, poetry, anything that festively raises up human existence and thereby constitutes its true riches, all derive their life from a hidden root. And this root is a contemplation which is turned toward God and the world so as to affirm them. Thus, to see reality as it is to understand it as a gift, and to return that giftedness in worship, contemplation, praise, affirmation, and gratitude. In his own landmark text, Maritain elaborates a notion of poetry that exceeds the art of writing verses. As he put it, poetry in this more universal sense is, quote, a process both more general and more primary, that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self. In keeping with the spirit of Herdelin's poem, the Catholic philosopher likewise figures poetry as a kind of divination. As was realized in ancient times, he says the Latin vates was both a poet and a diviner. Poetry in this sense is the secret life of each and all the arts. It thus requires a spirit and a disposition of contemplation. A return to poetry and to ourselves as poets in this universal sense thus reiterates the anthropological realities of human being, with its full depth dimension oriented toward the radical freedom and infinitude of dwelling with the divine presence both within and without. Recall our poet, David Jones, who was one of our many witnesses to poetry in barren times. He was also a contemporary of Maritain and found the latter's account of poetry, creativity, and philosophical aesthetics to be really deeply compelling for his own thinking about the creative process and the nature of art as such. In his essay, Art and Sacrament, Jones considers the idea that the human capacity for non-transitive, non-functional symbolic representation, this is what he calls sign-making, says something final and true about human nature. To be more precise, Jones says it is, quote, on account of the anthropic sign-making that we first suspect that anthropos has some part in a without-endedness. What he means is because human beings are the sorts of creatures who express themselves creatively, symbolically, and gratuitously, whether this expression is making art, carving primitive cave paintings, decorating a birthday cake, buying a rose for one's wife, they are always already oriented toward the sacred and the sacramental, whether they know it or not. To be a sign maker is to participate in the immensity and the mystery of without-endedness. And we are all fundamentally sign makers. As I begin to move now toward a conclusion, I'd like to consider not just the resources that Catholicism in general might have for the rehabilitation of ourselves as poets in this universal sense, but suggest, alongside my dear friend, Saint, and now Dr. John Henry Newman, that the Benedictine charism itself has singular gifts to offer on this front. Here, together in this beautiful place, founded by Benedictine monks on the bluffs of the Missouri River, on the feast day of Benedict's transitus from this life, it is perhaps easy to understand why Newman wrote in his essay, The Mission of St. Benedict, that the saint and all the Benedictines who follow in his footsteps possess a spiritual disposition that is nothing other than poetic. Benedictines, he thought, are the true poets. Indeed, monastic practice itself, Newman thought, was most poetical, insofar as it traded, quote, nature for art, the wide earth and the majestic heavens for the crowded city, the subdued and docile beasts of the field for the wild passions and rivalries of social life, tranquility for ambition and care, divine meditation for the exploits of the intellect, the creature for the creator. And so St. Anthony fled to the desert, and St. Hilarion sought the seashore, and St. Basil ascended the mountain ravine, and St. Benedict took refuge in his cave, and St. Giles buried himself in the forest, and St. Martin chose the broad river, in order that the world may be shut out of view, and the soul might be at rest. And such a rest of intellect and of passion as this is full of the elements of the poetical. Like Maritain, Newman also situates the poetic disposition in opposition to the scientific disposition, both of which are necessary as two modes of viewing things. While the scientific, again, is the realm of investigation, analysis, quantity, weight, measures, locales, and aims at conceptual mastery, What is required for poetic perception is quite different. In the poetic disposition, Newman suggests, we should not put ourselves above the objects in which it resides, but at their feet. We should feel them to be above and beyond us. We should look up to them. And that instead of fancying we can comprehend them, we should take for granted we are surrounded and comprehended by them ourselves. It implies that we understand them to be vast, immeasurable, impenetrable, inscrutable, mysterious, so that at best we are only forming conjectures about them, not conclusions. Poetry does not address the reason, but the imagination and affections. It leads, Newman says, to admiration, enthusiasm, devotion, and love. Here we find profound agreement between many of our thinkers with whom we have shared our company this evening. Newman, Maritain, Jones, Balthasar, all have suggested that at least one quality of the poetic, contemplative disposition that will return to us the power of our spiritual sight is the cultivation of gratitude and receptivity, wherein we practice how to see reality as it is, to see ourselves as we are, and to receive the good gifts of the Father of lights with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. To adopt this posture of genuine receptivity may be, I think, one of the greatest forms of Benedictine hospitality. I do not imagine this to be a slight or easy task. It will require the conscious cultivation of habitual practices which run exactly counter to the architects and perpetrators of barren times. It will require long periods of silence and solitude, reading poetry and fiction, writing, making, crafting, praying, walking, adoration, gardening, planting, tending, paying attention, holy hours, listening to music, throwing our phones into the sea, ora et labora. This poetic, almost Virgilian disposition that Newman sees at the heart of the Benedictine order is not fanciful, it's not unrealistic, but precisely what constitutes the Christian form of life and the only way at our disposal that we can see things as they really are. As Newman put it, the monks were not dreamy sentimentalists to fall in love with melancholy winds and purling rills and waterfalls and nodding groves. But their poetry is the poetry of hard work and hard fare, unselfish hearts and charitable hands. They could plow and reap, they could hedge and ditch, they could drain, they could lop, they could carpenter, they could thatch, they could make hurdles for their huts, they could make a road, they could divert or secure the streamlet's bed, they could bridge a torrent. These things too are poetry when undertaken in a contemplative spirit. The Benedictines, Newman thought, were primed to cultivate the hidden life necessary for a genuinely poetic disposition as they reaped and sowed and read and copied, sewed and embroidered, chanted and prayed. May we go and do likewise. And because poetry is prayer, and prayer is poetry, because today is one of St. Benedict's 2 feast days, and because the conference herewith is coming to an end, I thought we might close with a prayer of St. Benedict and pray that God would make verdant our barrenness and give us the strength and the courage to come to see things anew and aright. Let's pray. Gracious and Holy Father, grant us the intellect to understand you, reason to discern you, diligence to seek you, wisdom to find you, a spirit to know you, a heart to meditate upon you. May our ears hear you, may our eyes behold you, may our tongues proclaim you. Give us grace that our way of life may be pleasing to you, that we may have the patience to wait for you and the perseverance to look for you. Grant us a perfect end, your holy presence, a blessed resurrection, and life everlasting. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you for your lecture and words of wisdom this evening. And you talked about, with poetry, a rediscovery of, or digging deeper into anthropology. And what does it mean to be real? What does it mean to be human? As the church tries to step into the space with AI and lead with the advances of technology, how do you see the Catholic Church having a stronger voice in what it means to really be human and putting that at the forefront, not just in Catholic circles, but for humanity?
Starting off easy, I see. Good. Well, I think in terms of like articulating a Catholic anthropology, we have to do two things simultaneously, and I think they're both equally important. I think this understanding, as I was talking earlier about, the machines have no interiority, right? They cannot manifest or express some interior life that exceeds the algorithm, right? So, but human beings, I think, we sell ourselves short because we don't think of ourselves in that way, right? I mean, just thinking about those, think about the whole tradition, right? Think of Teresa of Avila, think of Augustine and the memory of our own kind of selves where God dwells, like in these deep recesses of the soul. We don't often act as if we believe that to be true. And, I think there's something there to say human beings have a tremendous depth dimension. I think there's this Oratorian priest, Gratry, I don't know if anyone's read it, his book's out of print, but it's called The Wellsprings, that I find absolutely deeply important. I mean, this Sertillange book, The Intellectual Life. Gratry is like the OG Sertillange. And Sertillange mentions him in the preface and says, I wouldn't have written this book if it weren't for Gratry. And he says, if you want to be an intellectual, if you want to have, to cultivate the soul, then, you must write. What will I write? Well, you go into your solitude and you sit and you listen to what Christ, the teacher who is within you, will tell you, right? I mean, so there's this kind of I don't think that we think that way about our own capacities, which are actually infinite, right? So I think we need to kind of recover and articulate this kind of sense of the sort of infinite horizon of human capacity. And at the same time, we have to say, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Right? We have to say both of those things in equal measure, I think, because a lot of the talks that I've heard this weekend have been, Catholicism aesthetically is able to deal with the really real, and the really real is that we have this transcendent capacity, but the really real is also finitude and sin and harm and our capacity to be hurt and all those things. So to me, the human being, we have to have both, which I think is the difficult thing, and that's why someone like David Jones I find so interesting. That any kind of symbolic act that we do means that we are participating in a without endedness, and yet here we are with bodies that will die. So we have to say both. Machines can't do that.
So thank you very much for a beautiful, I think, masterful talk, Dr. Martin. So, and I was interested when you mentioned, of course, Benedictines. And then, but in the back of my mind, there is an idea that I often think of, and I wonder how it comes out. And I thought you brought it in at the end. So the idea is this: in the ancient monastic teachings, you would start with something like practice before you got to nostike, or the active life, doing things, practice, before you could open up to the contemplative, right? So I thought that was very good towards the end when you brought that in with different practices, often very mundane things. And, we have to go through drudgery, we have to go through things like that. So one of the challenges from a monastic perspective for that today is I don't know what the proper term, I think of a term, I think Walker Percy uses like expropriation of domestic skills. Or something, there's like in the past, a couple of generations, yeah, the monks did build the roads. And now there's just everything is done by machinery. And it's so technical. So even when a monastery wants to get back to doing certain things, it's hard. And so, so people have, there's been a kind of return to the land kind of movement among Catholics, and some monks have taken it up. But any thoughts on that? Some of the challenges of getting back to doing things like that are just, they're so technical. I mean, another little example, I don't know if I made clear, but I remember when I was growing up, my father taught me how to change the oil in a car. They just don't do that anymore. It's too technical. So you have to go to a shop, get a machine, and it's kind of computer done. So any thoughts about that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, there's this poem by David Jones where one of the lines is, I have felt for his wounds in nozzles and containers, right? He's trying to find God in this modern world where it is hard to see God in the turn of a civilization, he says in this poem. And I kind of think that we have to avoid a nostalgia, which says like we ought to act as if these technologies don't exist, right? Because I mean, we do live in a world in which we do have to adapt, in which work takes on a different kind of thing. One of the things in Newman's little essay on the mission of St. Benedict, it wasn't quite that, it's like a sort of back to the land, and we're, I mean, it is that we're copying, we're all doing all these things, but he says the real kind of like way that a Benedictine charism is poetic is because you come in and you do what needs to be done, and you do it for the glory of God, one day at a time, even if it's boring. I mean, or even if it's like something that doesn't feed the soul or something like that. So it's like there's not a kind of ambition for greatness. There is the kind of simple, we'll do the thing that has to happen today, and then we'll go to bed, and then we'll do it again tomorrow. And I think that's kind of what he meant. So I don't think we should be nostalgic for a time when technology did not exist. But I also think we have to show up to the work, whatever the work is, in whatever kind of iteration it takes place in a modern world, with that same kind of contemplative spirit, right? But I also think everyone should keep a garden, and everyone should get their hands in the dirt, and everyone should do those things as well. But we can't act as if we want to live in the Middle Ages anymore.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I'm curious, as somebody that's going to be entering the classroom as an educator next year, and there's many of us around here this weekend, do you have any specific insights, strategies, methods on how an educator can go about sharing this arduous task of becoming more human, becoming sign makers with students? Any experiences you'd like to share?
I do teach an aesthetics course, which has gotten more, gradually more and more practical because, I think fundamentally, it's a course that is actually quite theoretical in a certain respect because it's tracing the development of metaphysics and eros and, this notion of desire all the way through from Plato through Augustine and Dante and, moving up toward kind of Ratzinger and more modern novels and poets. But I think the more I've taught the class, the more I've realized that, and this is not groundbreaking, that the real difficulty that my students have is that they just can't pay attention. They can't pay attention to anything. And so I've sort of built in some practices that are required for them to know. I know many of you in the room here do things like this, but at our art museum, we partner with them to do an assignment called Art 180, where they have to look at one piece of art for 3 hours. And they can break it up if they need to. They can go in, they can kind of clock in, sit with their piece of art. They can't do anything else, but they just are looking at the details, right? So that's one thing that I assign in this class. The other thing I mentioned it in one of the smaller sessions today is we do a session on Basil of Caesarea's homily on plants, and then I bring in cuttings for everyone, and it says you have to take care of this until it grows roots. You have to sustain it, and that's one thing I think that they've enjoyed. There are other, some of my colleagues at Notre Dame have students track the phases of the moon or track the seasons or things like that. So anything that kind of helps inculcate habitual practices of sustained attention is actually really good for all of us. I mean, all of my students, when they hear the art when anything, they think that's a terrible idea, I will hate that. And then they come back and they say, oh, actually, I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in a decade. And so, you know, it's, I mean, I think it's important, like, to give them something where they can, I mean, I really mean this, that the poetic disposition has to be receptivity, right? We have to, like, really see things as they are, really see other people as they are. And that takes patience and time, and, like, we have to stop being so busy and crossing things off our list, yeah.
I was inspired by the way that you were able to grab at verses of poetry just so naturally. And I would say I'm infantile in my journey into poetry, and I suspect maybe some others are as well. I have the blessing of teaching kindergarten, and so I've grown in my love of poetry and teaching them and getting to experience the verse with them. But I wondered if you have any just good entry points for people who are beginning their journey into poetry, whether it be a poet or a specific poem, or just a way that if you weren't steeped in that, maybe in childhood, in your own education, but what would be a good entry point for an adult?
For an adult, I mean, when I homeschooled my kids for a year, and we used that, what is the Harp and the Laurel book, and so I just had them just basically write poetry, you know, and then, you know, have them memorize things. Like, but I think for an adult, I mean, I think, yeah, poetry can be difficult, right? I teach this course for retirees, and they're like retired lawyers and like CEOs and pilots and FBI agents. They're like very fancy, very accomplished people. And the one time I tried, we tried to do Hopkins on the very first day. They were like, oh no, yeah, we don't do this. This is not. So I had to kind of work up to it, you know. So of course I'm going to say, oh, you should read Hopkins. But sometimes it can be a little off-putting. I think the same for Eliot. I mean, if someone is really just getting into it, I would say, like, what about Mary Oliver, someone like that, you know? So it's like, it's a little bit more accessible. I think she's got some lovely things. Denise Levertov, I think, is a very interesting poet. That would be maybe more, but of course, ultimately, I would think, yeah, someone like Hopkins, who is like able to, his capacity for speech, for these different ways of using language, I think it's really important to get somewhere like that, or Eliot, of course. But I mean, of course, I'm like taking all the like, of course, the usual suspects kind of situation here, but Richard Wilbur, a little shout out to your guy. He's a good one.
Dr. Martin, if only the lover sings in the context of ora et labora, or labora et ora, and the sings is the psalms of the ora, wouldn't the lover correspond to the labora? Because I think there's part of this problem is the conception of work as task. Mm-hmm. And even if we think about it in terms of efficiency, right? Because the death knell of the student is when they're trying to get the work done, mm-hmm. and trying to hand it in. No, that's what correcting is. Mm-hmm. That's not what doing, you know, that's not what producing the work is. So I think there's almost there's a way of understanding the poetic as husbandry, in the sense of enjoying the productive nature of the thing you're working with that you cannot control. Mm-hmm. Because this plant either likes a lot of sun or doesn't like a lot of sun, or needs to be in this type of soil, this other type of soil. And I have to know that, and I have to respect that, and I have to learn that in order to put it in its culture, right? The set of circumstances that maximize its growth potential. So I just find that even showing that is true in the intellectual life, yep. That there really is an thing, and then the outpouring of that is the prayer.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. I mean, I love the way Jacques Martin talks about poetry, because it's like, it is that thing which has no object, right? I mean, when things have an, it's liberal in that sort of like true classic sense. It is the place of like radical freedom. It's the thing that reminds you that you are an eternal soul who will live forever, and you can peel the carrots like an eternal soul who will live forever. Like it is this kind of like, of course I'm thinking of that movie, Integrate Silence, where you're peeling carrots for like 30 minutes, which is beautiful, but you should know what you're getting into. But yeah, I mean, I think that's right. This idea that even work has to maintain that kind of like underlying current of life and freedom, to which we are all called, right? Love calls us to the things of this world, right? To quote another poem. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But I think that has implications too for how we teach, right? I mean, like if we have to think about. One of the things that's really important, I think, for me is like we've talked a lot this weekend about like, well, how do we like connect with people who maybe aren't interested in the arts, or connect with people who aren't like Catholic or are serious about being Catholic. I think the thing that we have to start with is that human experience of longing and desire, which everybody shares. This idea that you see something really beautiful, no matter who you are, and it's, you feel yourself getting punched in the chest a little bit. It's like that kind of longing or that kind of desire is a universal human experience, and I think that's where we start. And that I think is orienting oneself to this broader universal notion of poetry, which calls us to our own transcendence, right? We cannot forget, it's not just, trying to sound smart in rhyme. It is literally a kind of like full body spiritual disposition that will be really difficult to communicate, but we have to, day by day, step by step, encourage these practices in our students and in ourselves, which will kind of build this idea. I think that's really important pedagogically.
Well, you kind of beat me to the punch.
Oh.
So you answered my question partially there at the end. My question would be around the issue of people who are not Catholic or not Christian, or people. I mean, we're trapped in this, inability to see reality and needing to have our own hearts awakened back to being able to feel that real wonder and that longing for the infinite. And we're, receiving God in the Eucharist. So I guess my question would be that question of mission, or that creation of some kind of an experience or a place that could help create that longing. And I'm thinking of, in my talk, I quoted von Balthasar in that little book, Test Everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in that conversation with Scola, and he asks himself, he says, what are we to do with the lack of culture wrought by the machine? Mm-hmm. And which we're awash in that reality now. That was in the 70s.
Right.
And he says, I suppose we can build islands of humanity. And I guess if we're going to say that an island of humanity is a place where when people dwell there with us, their desire and their longing for the fullness of reality is awakened, I guess I would ask you, what do you think that looks like?
So when I'm thinking about like something like aesthetics, right? I hesitate to prescribe too much about like what exactly it looks like in terms of form, right? Because I'm with Balthasar all the way, where he says that beauty is like the Holy Spirit, and it's turning up all over everywhere, like in rhythm and in form and in line and in color and in speech, all these different ways. But I kind of wonder. This is not a very formed thought, I guess, yet, but I think there's something really powerful if we're not yet able, or if like non-believers or non-Catholics are not yet able to recognize this fullness of transcendence with the anthropology. I think Catholics are also really good at being realistic about human experience, about and like being able to recognize and articulate and not be shy or prudish about articulating what real human experience is like, which can run the gamut of the very, very good to the very, very bad. You know, and I think that's actually something that Catholics can offer the world, to sort of mirror back, like, what's real. I mean, that's why I became a Catholic, because it's just like Catholicism has a capacity of saying, of looking at reality and naming it for what it is. And I think that's kind of important, you know, not to say like, oh, you know, well, I'll turn out in the wash, or, you know, like, all will be well, you know, Easter. I mean, I think like as a Balthasarian, of course, I'm like, Holy Saturday. You know, you have to kind of dwell with all of that and have it, and I think Catholics are quite good at naming reality. And I think there's something kind of affirming about that. You know, I am human and nothing human is alien to me. To quote, you know, this idea that everything can be transformed by grace. But sometimes we just have to articulate what nature is before we can talk about how grace builds on nature. And I think Catholics are good at that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin.
All right. Thank you, Jenny.